Where should a catcher put his throwing hand while catching? Coming up next. In this video, we will look at the best place for a catcher to put his throwing hand, but more than just that, we will look at the history of Major League Baseball and how professional catchers have evolved in this respect, and show where the youth catcher should and should not put their throwing hand. Before we begin, let's dispel one common myth right off the bat. The myth says that you need to keep your throwing hand near the glove so your exchange on throwing out runners is quicker. That is a myth and can be disproven very quickly, which I will do in a minute. So most who believe this myth want the catcher to place his hand right behind a glove so it's safe from the foul ball, protected by the glove, and allows for faster exchanges on throws. This is in fact one place that the catcher should never put his throwing hand under any circumstance. He will gain nothing of an advantage but will risk breaking a finger. It's not if it will happen, but when. It's wrong, and never ever put your hand behind a glove when receiving. As far as the hand being protected, no, it wanders once the glove needs to move. It's a dangerous practice. Putting this quicker exchange myth to bed, here are the numbers. The Major League Baseball average exchange rate is 0.73 seconds according to StatCast. That's 0.73 seconds from the time the ball hits the glove to the time it's out of the throwing hand. Here's our catcher when he was 13. This is a 0.53 second exchange from 2019 and still is his fastest recorded exchange. The throwing hand was not behind the glove. Here is Yan Gomes. He threw in 2015 this 0.483 second exchange according to StatCast. His hand was not behind the glove. This is the fastest exchange rate I've ever seen recorded. Just for fun, let's sync these two catch and throws together. Gomes versus a 13-year-old. The videos are synced at the frame that the ball hits the back of the glove, so they both get the ball at the same time. It's playing at 1/8 speed. Well, that was fun. Tracking the difference between 5/100ths of a second with a 30 frame rate video is not very easy. So our catcher's average exchange rate over the past 3 years has been 0.69. Besides the one time he hit 0.53, he has hit 0.60 at least a couple times every year. Here's one of those. First and foremost, make sure no catcher ever puts his hand here like this. He's going to get hit by a foul ball and break a finger. That's 6 weeks on the disabled list, which for a youth player can be the whole season. So now that that's out of the way, where should a catcher put his hand? That is coming up after we look at the Major League Baseball World Series history starting from 1955 and skipping every 10 years. You will notice these catchers here do have their hand by the glove, but it's not for the exchange. It's because they used this glove. It required two hands to secure the ball. The glove only stopped the ball. The throwing hand secured it in place. In 1965, 10 years later, the catchers were doing this. Looks pretty much the same, but that's because this was just before the one-handed catcher's glove became popular. By 1975, we have catchers using the one-hand glove. The two catchers are the famous Carlton Fisk and Johnny Bench. And here's some trivia. Carlton Fisk was my neighbor in 1993 and 94. That was the year that the White Sox screwed him over by intentionally not inviting him to the park during the 1993 ALCS, even though he was part of the team earlier in the year. He showed up to the first game and ended up driving home as they refused to grant him entrance. And yes, he did live just down the road from me that year. So Carlton Fisk puts his hand by his right foot on most pitches. He's only up in the danger zone when there's 2 strikes or with a runner on base. Basically, if he may need to block, his hand is ready to do so. This is really the only reason to have a hand anywhere but by the right foot. More on that later. Johnny Bench is more unpredictable. He's here like this the whole first inning and then down by his foot in later innings. With a runner on base, he's also like Carlton Fisk. In 1985, we are split, with one catcher almost always with his hand by the foot except for with runners on base. The other catcher is always behind the glove. He has his hand in a loose fist with his thumb inside to protect it. That's something we still teach when the hand is not protected. 1995, this first catcher is again back behind the foot until 2 strikes or a runner on base, so anytime he may need to block. The second catcher is always by the right foot in every situation. But check out the stance for both catchers. This one is set up like this with a runner on who may steal. The other is always like this. It's crazy to think back to when every catcher was taught that this was the only way to set up as a catcher. Thankfully, that's no longer being taught. 2005, we have our first catcher using what we now teach as the second spot to place a throwing hand. With runners on base or a batter with 2 strikes, the hand is tucked into the right hip area. No runners on and less than 2 strikes, and the hand is by the foot. The second catcher, again, is always by the right foot in all situations. Finally, the last year, 2015. This one is a little more interesting. The first catcher is pretty predictable, just like in the last two. Hand by the foot unless 2 strikes or a runner on base. But Salvador Perez is doing something different. He's got his hand by his foot all the time, except if both conditions are true. 2 strikes or a runner on base, and the pitch is going to be a curveball or a ball he may need to block. So he's by his foot on fastballs even with runners on base or 2 strikes. This way he is still ready to block when needed, but increases his hand protection since he only puts his hand here on a curveball or maybe a changeup. And then I caught this pitch. Wow! His hand is in one of the places we now teach, but it still gets hit. You need to understand just how rare this is. This spot is the least likely spot to get hit by a foul ball. The angle the ball needs to travel in order to hit this spot is usually protected by the glove. I randomly chose pitches to watch for these games and only a small sample of each year. The chances that I stumbled across this pitch is simply amazing. So what is the answer? We put our hand here or here. The only reason we would put our hand here, tucked in by the hip, is so it's easier to block a ball. And since you do not need to ever block a ball when there's less than 2 strikes and no runners on base, you do not need your hand here in those situations. So where should you teach your catcher to put his hand? Well, that's up to you obviously, but if you go here, it's going to be risky. So you need to balance that injury risk with the ability to block. You could reduce your risk like Perez did and only put the hand here on balls that could need to be blocked. And remember, we don't typically block fastballs. Those are usually picked. It's too much to expect a catcher to block a fastball, but you never want the hand wandering into no man's land or behind the glove. And if your catcher puts his hand by the foot, but on every pitch is pulling it out, you may need to have him go behind his back until he gets more experience. And again, it does not matter where the hand starts on any throws. A quicker catcher is going to be quick no matter where the hand starts. So don't put the hand here, please. It's not helping you have a faster pop time.